Welcome back to part two of perennial warm season grasses in our class of PLS 510, forage management and utilization. Today we're going to take a look at the species or individual species of perennial warm season grasses that we utilize most in Kentucky. We're going to start with switchgrass or Panicum virgatum. Switchgrass heads only once per season, so that's called a determinate plant. It is the earliest of the native warm season grasses to mature, and we abbreviate native warm season grasses NWSG oftentimes. The seed is the easiest to handle of all of the native grasses. It is slick and round and looks like some of our traditional forage seeds. It is less wildlife friendly, or considered to be less wildlife friendly, and also more invasive as a species than the other native warm season grasses. And it overlaps with tall fescue during spring. So for that reason, if you're trying to grow tall fescue and switchgrass together, in order to keep the switchgrass from getting ahead of you, you typically have to leave the tall fescue before you've grazed it down all the way. But if it's toxic tall fescue and the summer is beginning to warm up, that is not a bad thing. Unlike the other native grasses, there is a bigger decline in animal performance when switchgrass gets mature than compared to BB, which is big bluestem, IG, or Indian grass, and EG is eastern gamagrass. There are both upland and lowland types, and these look very different. The lowland types are very tall growing, very coarse, and the lowland types tolerate flooding and saturated soils very well. Moving on to big bluestem, which has the scientific name Andropogon gerardii. Big bluestem heads once per season, like switchgrass. It's later maturing than switchgrass. Unprocessed seed is fluffy and hard to handle compared to switchgrass, where it is slick and flows easily. A process known as debearding helps. In other words, the big bluestem seed has structures on it called beards that can be processed to the point that it knocks those off, and that helps. Big bluestem is slow to emerge with low seedling vigor and high seed dormancy in some years. More palatable than switchgrass, not SG rather than SB. It's more friendly to wildlife than switchgrass. And like switchgrass, though, it requires rotational stocking and attention to not overgraze it in order for it to persist. It has a high minimum grazing height, 8 inches plus, so you're going to want to pull off of a big bluestem paddock before you're getting down below the 8-inch level. And it does require rest in the fall from about mid to late September on. The next species we'll talk about is Indian grass, or Sorghastrum nutans. Indian grass heads once per year. It's later to mature than big bluestem or switchgrass, but a lot of times big bluestem and Indian grass are raised together in a stand, which will allow the growth peaks or the growth curve to extend just a little bit compared to either one alone. Unprocessed seed of Indian grass is also fluffy and hard to handle. And again, debearding helps it too. Just like big bluestem, it's slow to emerge with low seedling vigor. In some years, the seed can be quite dormant, which means that it's just going to lay in the soil for more than a year before it comes up. With our traditional cool season species, we really expect them. They have low seed dormancy. In other words, we expect most of the seed that we plant to, if the conditions are conducive for germination, for them to germinate that year. Not so with the natives. Indian grass is also more palatable than switchgrass. Again, that error, not SB, but SG. Also more friendly to wildlife than switchgrass. Again, rotational stocking needed, high minimum grazing heights, and it requires a fall rest. So Indian grass and big bluestem are very, very similar, as you can see, and for that reason they are raised together many times. This happens to be Jeff Cassida down in Clay County working with Ron Bowling with a stand of native warm season grasses that Ron established or has been working on establishing on his farm. He's got a farm that's along a creek with bottomland and also hill land, but he is raising freezer beef. And so he very much needed to have some very high quality summer pasture available, and he chose, after doing research, to go with a mix of big bluestem and Indian grass. And Ron has been highly successful in both getting his initial seeding established and brought onto production, but he's added more acres. And this is a picture of some of those freezer beef steers on big bluestem and Indian grass down in Clay County in 2018. Move on to another native warm season grass, and that's eastern gamagrass, and we'll abbreviate it EG for the purposes of saving space on slides. But it, as you can see, is a tall and coarse growing or erect and tall growing grass. Its genus species name or scientific name is Tripsicum dactyloides. And if you look at eastern gamagrass, it happens to be a relative of corn, but now look in the bottom lower right-hand corner. When you graze it off or clip it off, you will see that the tillers will be growing in a circular pattern around a hollow middle. And that hollow middle, if you were to get down there and dig, is very thick and dense rhizomes. So that is very characteristic of eastern gamagrass, and different than switch, Indian grass, or big bluestem. Eastern gamagrass is also different in that it produces seed heads throughout the season. So in other words, if you cut it for hay or graze it hard, then the next growth, if you let it grow long enough, it'll make seed heads. And if you harvest that and let the next growth come, it'll make seed heads. If you're working with Indian grass or big bluestem or switchgrass, once those seed heads are produced and either clipped or grazed off, then it's going to be vegetative for the remainder of the season. It is a very high-yielding bunch grass. It's a relative of corn, and similar to corn, it needs deep soils for high yields. It does tolerate wet soils. It is very clumpy, though, with crowns that can get to be very tall. Very wildlife friendly. While it can be used for hay, it's more utilized or more friendly for pasture. That clumpy growth with those very tall crowns and will make driving across that field with hay equipment pretty, well, I won't say difficult, but uncomfortable. It is very up and down and not going to be easy to pass over it with harvesting equipment. It does require rotational stocking with high minimum grazing heights, 8 inches or more. It does require fall rest, and the seed can also have a high degree of dormancy. We use a process known as stratification, which is an artificial treatment of cold and wet to these seeds to try to get them to break dormancy, and that process is called stratification. Now let's talk about a native warm season grass we don't like to see and we seldom seed, if ever, and it's broom sage, Andropogon virginicus. It's native to Kentucky, and it's not considered desirable, but you can graze it or even hay it, and we oftentimes do, whether we want to or not. Its quality is much better when it's vegetative. In fact, you probably only see it in a field, you only recognize it to be present in a field when it's in that very tall, mature, and tan stage that we see in the late fall. It is a very strong perennial, and this forage is absolutely adapted to low pH sites and low fertility sites. And as we are learning from, again, a study I've showed you pictures of in this class more than once, broom sage is not competitive with cool season species growing with it that are well managed and fertilized. Now, we've talked a little bit about the characteristic of the seed of native grasses, and so I want to show you examples of 3 of these and also a mechanism that we use in the seed boxes of drills to try to move seed through the drill better. Upper left is Indian grass, and you can see the awns, that long structure, the beards, which is the finer hairs on that leaf, and you can just imagine how hard it would be to get those to flow smoothly through equipment. Eastern gamma grass, the lower left, on the other hand, it's not hard at all to move through equipment. In fact, it is a relative of corn, and so you can plant it much like corn, at least using the old type corn planters as I understand it. I am not a corn expert, nor am I an expert on corn planting equipment. But those seed of eastern gamma grass there are about the size of small round kernels of corn. On the lower right is a close-up of switchgrass seed. And it's easy to see how that it is slick and would flow very easily through traditional equipment. And in the upper right is a picture of of special agitators in one particular kind of seed box that would keep the seed moving back and forth within a seed box. And at the bottom of these native warm season grass seed boxes are actually fingers that rotate through that pile of seed and pull it and move it down through the tubes and down to where it gets planted in the ground. And the last native warm season grass that I want to talk about is Bermuda grass, scientific name Cynodon dactylon, and you can see a vegetative example on the left. Upper right is a seed head, and then lower right is a particular seed stalk or a tiller of Bermuda grass. The adaptation for Bermuda grass is almost a complete flip of species like orchard grass or timothy, in that it goes up through Kentucky or peaks out right about the top of Kentucky, and is very well adapted to the deep south and lower south and southwest. If you take a look at the characteristics of Bermuda grass, it heads throughout the summer. In other words, it's going to make multiple seed heads, or multiple flushes of growth throughout the summer. It's usually considered a grass for the lower south, although we can easily grow it in Kentucky. It's adapted for pasture or for hay. It's lower growing than the natives, and it has aggressive sod-forming growth habit from stolons, and stolons are horizontal, above ground, rooting stems. A disadvantage of Bermuda grass is that it is lower growing and less wildlife friendly than the native grasses. It's very persistent, and on the flip side of that, you might call that a disadvantage because it can be invasive if it gets into fields where it is not wanted. It withstands and tolerates overgrazing or close grazing, and it can be established either by seed or sprigs. Now, the hybrid types, which are typically are the lower south type of Bermuda grasses, are only established vegetatively or by sprigs. That is, we take sections of stems that are alive, move them quickly to a field where we're going to plant. We use a specialized equipment called a sprigger, or we very carefully disc them into the top 2 or 3 inches, and then that is sprigging. In other words, seeding from vegetative pieces of Bermuda grass plants. The seeded types are also called common, and they're typically less palatable, but there are more and more varieties of the seeded types available for use in Kentucky. And Bermuda grass is highly responsive to nitrogen. Bermuda grass can be grazed closer than any of the other species that we commonly use in Kentucky, like bluegrass or orchard grass or tall fescue, because it has greater leaf area close to the ground, and because those stolons can move sideways and fill in to the bare areas next to it. And the last point I want to make about Bermuda grass is that because it is a summer grass, because it is low growing, prostrate, and withstands close defoliation, it also can be used and makes it for horse pasture, and it can be very ideal for horse pasture. This is a photograph of thoroughbreds on Bermuda grass from a seeded type of Bermuda grass established at the UK Agronomy Farm in Lexington, Kentucky. And Dr. Bob Coleman was able to carry a high number of horses on a small area of land that typically would not work at all, were this a bluegrass, orchard grass, or tall fescue pasture. But because it was Bermuda grass and it was rotated and also fertilized with nitrogen, they were able to carry a high number of horses on a small area of land and yet maintain good grass cover, as you can see here. So this brings to a close this second half of our perennial warm season grass lecture. So until next time, we'll see you then.